Hello and welcome to our reading of the second sonnet by William Shakespeare. This is sonnet number 2, the second in his opening series of sonnets that are sometimes called the procreation sonnets or the marriage sonnets. And the opening line of sonnet 1, which we looked at last time, really becomes an excellent paradigm or an excellent cornerstone for us as we look at these first 17 or 18 or so sonnets in this series. The opening line of sonnet 1 being, "From fairest creatures we desire increase." From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. That's another important image for us as well. The beauty's rose might never die. We'll notice in the opening of sonnet 2, the indication of time, 40 winters, that one of the major emphases of Shakespeare's is the ravaging onslaught of time, that time marches forward unapologetically, and along with it, it furrows beauty. The opening lines of sonnet 2 will give us that imagery. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, these deep trenches being wrinkles in the fields of beauty. And so the forward march of time is something that Shakespeare is going to return to. This is the product of the fall in Christian imagery, that the burden of mortality that Shakespeare explores in Hamlet, for instance, is a matter that he similarly explores in these sonnets, that there will come a day when we shuffle off our mortal coil, to quote Hamlet. And so this desire for the increase of beauty, particularly through childbearing, is going to serve as the central theme of these opening sonnets for Shakespeare. But it's also because he seems to have a larger vision in mind, that beauty's rose might never die. This instinct that we may have for immortality, that we are hunching towards the eternal always, that as T.S. Eliot explores in the Four Quartets, we believe that every moment of time touches eternity. There are these intersecting points of transcendence, of meaning, of eternal reality that we seem to have an ache for in our human experience. We want our lives to be meaningful, and we want them somehow to transcend mere mortality. They want to transcend just a material realm, and somehow the notion that beauty might endure despite the aging of my body is one that I think Shakespeare is quite curious about, and if we're honest, you and I are probably curious about as well. So sonnet 1 begins with this opening line, "From fairest creatures we desire increase." This is often connected to the commandment in Genesis that Adam and Eve were given in Eden, to be fruitful and multiply. And so that is the speaker's concern for this young man as well, that in sonnet 1, in this sonnet as well, the urge is for this young man to be fruitful and multiply, so that his beauty can endure through his offspring and somehow in that way become eternal. This is, of course, something that he concludes sonnet 18 with, that great sonnet, that when in eternal lines to time thou growest, that so long as men can live and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So this idea of eternality is always at the tip of Shakespeare's pen, it seems. So let's look at it. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow, and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field. We have this military language that comes strong right in the opening 2 lines. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow. Notice thy brow is the singular direct object of the besieging. So in this dependent clause here, when 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, it's time that is the active agent. The winters are besieging thy brow. And notice this contrast between a plural subject and a singular object. That we have 40 winters pressing in on this young man's single brow. It gives this overwhelming effect of being outnumbered and outgunned. These 40 winters seem to press in from all sides on his brow and to besiege it. That's, of course, a strong, a verb that carries strong militaristic diction, connotations to it, of besieging, of surrounding and occupying. And how do these 40 winters besiege the brow? They dig deep trenches. And of course, these trenches in thy beauty's field would be the furrowed brow, the wrinkles of age. And notice something more with the language here. The sonnet begins with the word when. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches. It's worth noticing he doesn't say if. It's not a question of whether or not 40 winters will besiege thy brow. The question is, when will they? It's not a matter of whether or not. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held. So this is the language of certainty here. When they come, thy youth's proud livery, your proud, magnificent uniform of military, your soldier's uniform, your livery, neat and pressed and magnificent, it will be a tattered weed. And notice the wordplay there of a weed in beauty's field, but also the livery, the uniform that he wears now, that he wears for a time, it will eventually become a weed, a tattered garment. It is inevitable. This inevitability is cemented even further in how the language of these words are connected. When winter. So you have alliteration there with the w sound. Same here, besiege thy brow and dig deep. So the alliteration connects this notion of beauty, the young man's image, and the ravaging of winter and the digging of deep trenches and the besieging of the brow. So the alliteration connects these ideas even further, but also the assonance. A sound quality, when winter. Winter, which of course has connotations of aging and dying. This season is quite different from spring, which is referenced in Sonnet 1. Now we have winter. And of course, winter is in line 1, and the final word is cold, aided by that rhyming couplet, old and cold, at the end. So this sonnet has a quite different atmosphere to it, that when winter besieges the brow, your proud livery will be a tattered weed. That again, the transience of things is evoked here for Shakespeare, that your proud livery is real and true and gazed on by many for now. He did the same thing in Sonnet 1. Thou who art now young and lovely will one day age. So we transition to the second quatrain. This is the first. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow, and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held. Then, notice, when this happens, then this will happen. We get a second iteration of this certainty of time and its effects on all mortals. Then being asked where all thy beauty lies, where all the treasure of thy lusty days, what has happened to beauty? To say within thine own deep sunken eyes. Remember this double adjective from Sonnet 1, thine own. That the young man, if he does not bear a child, if he does not pass his beauty on, he will become a victim of his own self-possession. That in Sonnet 1 we saw as narcissism. Thine own eyes he retains, but they have become hollow and deep sunken. Being asked where all thy beauty lies, where all the treasure of thy lusty days, to say within thine own deep sunken eyes were an all-eating shame and thriftless praise. So for this young man to become an old man, and when asked where all his beauty lies, to reply, it lies within his own deep sunken eyes. This is an all-eating shame and thriftless praise. So it's an all-eating shame in the sense that it's a shame from having consumed all of his beauty for himself. Remember in Sonnet 1, he's compared to a glutton who eats his beauty because he does not, in his generosity, share it in reproducing and passing it on to the next generation. Here again, the shame is from his conduct of consuming his own beauty by hoarding it for himself. That idea of hoarding will come up again in this last quatrain when we get the language of commerce and investments and finances. So it's an all-eating shame, a shame from all eating, but also, of course, an all-consuming shame. It's an all-eating shame, that it's a shame that reduces him to remorse and guilt in his own hollowness in his old age. And again, it's a thriftless praise. It's a praise for having lived thriftlessly or wastefully, but also it's a thriftless praise. It's meaningless. It's of small worth. So now we turn. How much more praise deserved thy beauty's use? So notice this goes back to the central theme. From fairest creatures we desire increase. How much more praise, not thriftless praise, but more, deserved thy beauty's use? This is in the sense of an investment when it comes to tracts of land and so on. How much more praise deserved thy beauty's use if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count and make my old excuse. So notice, when 40 winters besiege thy brow, thy youth's proud livery will be a tattered weed. But there's hope. How much more praise deserved thy beauty's use if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count and make my old excuse, proving his beauty by succession thine. So notice this opportunity the man has. If you can answer that this fair child of mine shall sum my count, then the ravaging of winter will not be so deadly. It will not be so fatal. But it's up to you. This is a choice. This is not a certainty. You may or may not be able to answer this way depending on your choices now. Will you marry? Will you reproduce? Will you bear children and pass your beauty on to the next generation, or will you eat it all yourself and hoard it within thine own deep sunken eyes. So now this is not just a call to abandon narcissism. This is also a personal call to seek the praise of thy beauty even more by sharing it, by distributing it to children. How much more praise deserve thy beauty's use, if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count, and make my old excuse. So notice this language of the market, that all thy beauty, all the treasure can come to this, that he may not be able to preserve all his beauty. Time marches forward, but he can transfer his beauty to his child. He can credit his beauty to his child's account, and in that way preserve a portion of it through inheritance. Quite literally, that the child proves his beauty by succession, that he inherits it like he inherits a fortune, like he inherits his father's name, that he also inherits the beauty that his father would have. And Shakespeare makes the case that if you can answer the questioners that this fair child of mine shall sum my count, that this fair child of mine shall bear the receipt, he shall be the proof of this transfer and justify my old age, then he proves his beauty by succession thine. And somehow this beauty is both the young man of the sonnet and it's his child's, proving his beauty, thy beauty, that it is preserved through his lineage, preserved through his descendants, much like his financial inheritance would. And rather than be wasteful and thriftless, all his treasure could be kept in the line and not disintegrated through the wasteful squandering of his youth toward old age. So Shakespeare then ends with his closing couplet, in which he explores a pair of paradoxes. This whole sonnet, this whole possibility, this were to be new made when thou art old, and see thy blood warm when thou feelst it cold. Remember, we started with winter. Now we come back. The aging process is a certainty that the clothing of youth will be shuffled off, that winter comes and we all grow cold in the process of growing old. But Shakespeare says, to do this, though, to marry, to bear children, to raise them well, this is to be new made when thou art old. So Shakespeare explores this death and rebirth paradigm. Which again seems central to our human experience, this instinct for immortality. That beauty's rose might never die is what he says in Sonnet 1. We want to be reborn. We want to never die, even in the face of growing old, even in the face of dying. This is that Christian prospect of being born again. Hinted at, suggested, this were to be born again, this were to be made new when thou art old, and see thy blood warm when thou feelst it cold. And notice that you have this almost sentimental, but not saccharine, I think, quite lovely image of the deathbed here, that you would see your children surrounding you when you are feeling the chill of death. And in this way, rather than the 40 winters of age and death surrounding you, you now are surrounded by your own warm blood and your own youth passed on in the next generation when you finally come to die. All right, so thank you for coming with me as we explore Sonnet 2. Stay tuned next time as we look at Sonnet 3.